Attempted murder suspect Mark Scott-Crossley has handed himself over to police at the police college in Pretoria. Scott Crosley has been on the run for the past 5 weeks after he allegedly ran over a farm worker in Hoedspruit in Limpopo in December. Scott Crosley previously served 5 years in prison after he ordered farm workers to throw a fellow worker, Nelson Chisale, into a lion enclosure in 2004.
In the vast untamed wilderness of South Africa's Limpopo province, far from the bustling cities and tourist hotspots, lay a quiet farming community. Here, the rhythms of life were dictated by the land and its inhabitants. It was a place where secrets were closely guarded and disputes were often settled in a manner as primal as the landscape itself. In this remote corner of the world, a dark and twisted tale of vengeance would unfold, shocking the nation and the world. Born to parents Paul and Noreen in 1967, Mark Scott-Crossley's life has been marked by a series of significant events that culminated with him doing the unthinkable. It began with the tragic loss of his younger brother Hayden, who died at the age of 4.5 months due to a disease affecting the large intestine. Mark was just a toddler at the time, growing up with a grieving mother. A few years later, when Mark was 7, his family welcomed his sister, Tracy Lee. The two siblings quickly developed a strong bond, but as Mark reached the age of 21, tragedy struck again. On July 30, 1988, after Mark refused to accompany his 14-year-old sister, Tracy Lee was kidnapped by a notorious serial killer, Gert van Rooyen, and his partner while on her way to Cresta shopping center. This event led to a massive manhunt and the subsequent disappearances of other young girls in the Johannesburg suburbs, collectively known as the Missing Six. Van Rooyen and his partner were ultimately found dead after taking their own lives, but a guilt-stricken Mark faced turmoil and profound grief as his sister remained missing. Despite the nation's belief that she was kidnapped, there are some conflicting claims which allege that Tracy Lee may have run away from home. The memories of Tracy Lee and the other missing girls eventually faded from the public consciousness. However, in 2004, Mark Scott-Crossley became involved in a horrifying crime which resulted in the death of a former employee.
Scott Crosley ordered 2 of his employees to throw a fellow worker, Nelson Chisale, into a lion's den.
Mark Scott-Crossley was not a man to be trifled with. He was an imposing figure with a reputation for being ruthless and unforgiving. In the early 2000s, he owned a farm near the town of Hoedspruit, where he employed a small workforce of mostly laborers from the impoverished neighboring villages. Among them was Nelson Chisale, a 38-year-old father of 3 who had come to the farm in search of a better life. It was a sweltering day in January 2004 when tensions reached their breaking point. An incident had occurred that would set in motion a chain of events that would forever stain the tranquil landscape with blood. Scott Crosley had recently fired Chisale from his construction business at the Engedi Game Farm. Chisale had been helping with the construction of a lodge on the farm before he was fired and subsequently assaulted when he returned to collect some personal belongings. Chisale had earlier filed charges with the police accusing Scott Crosley of burning clothes the worker had left at the farm. Witnesses would later testify that they saw Chisale being severely beaten by Scott Crosley and his accomplices, a group of farm workers who worked for him. But the horror didn't stop there. What happened next would shock the world and earn Mark Scott-Crossley a place in the infamous books of South African true crime. After the savage beating, Chisale was left for dead, lying motionless on the sun-baked earth. But that was not enough for Scott Crosley. In a chilling act of brutality, Scott Crosley and his accomplices decided to dispose of the evidence in the most gruesome way imaginable. The farm was situated near the home to a pride of hungry lions, and it was decided that Chisale's lifeless body would be fed to these apex predators. The group loaded Chisale's battered and lifeless form onto a pickup truck and drove to the lion enclosures. There, They tossed Chisale's body into the waiting jaws of the hungry beasts, ensuring that nothing would remain to tell the tale of their vicious crime. In the days that followed, the disappearance of Nelson Chisale did not go unnoticed. Suspicion soon fell on Scott Crosley and his gang of farm workers, with the authorities being alerted. A massive manhunt was launched, and it didn't take long for the gruesome truth to emerge. The crime was discovered in February 2004 when workers at the Mokolo White Lion Project found a skull, several bones, and some blood-soaked clothes believed to belong to Chisale. The lions had not entirely consumed Chisale's body, and investigators were able to recover enough evidence to confirm that he had been murdered. Mark Scott-Crossley was arrested and charged with murder along with several of his accomplices. The trial that followed captivated the nation as the prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who believed he was above the law. They alleged he had taken the law into his own hands and exacted a horrifying form of vigilante justice. A large police contingent closed off the area outside the court's holding cells after a crowd of people had gathered around the gates in the hope of catching a glimpse of the accused killers, Scott Crosley, Richard Matebula, and Simon Matebula. A fourth man, Robert Nisi, turned state witness and was promised immunity from prosecution. The men were accused of throwing Chisale into a pen of 5 lions, which subsequently ate him. Richard's trial was postponed after he fell ill, but he later died in a hospital from tuberculosis. The courtroom drama unfolded at the Phalaborwa Circuit Court in the northeastern Limpopo province, and it was evident that tensions ran high. The proceedings were marked by tight security measures, including a thorough sweep for explosive devices. Police presence both in the courtroom and outside the courthouse was notably robust due to concerns about potential demonstrations. At the heart of the trial was the question of whether Scott Crosley, who was 37 years old at the time, had ordered the killing, as claimed by his workers. Central to the case was the debate about Chisale's state when he was thrown to the lions, as well as the extent of Scott Crosley's involvement. The court heard how the tragic chain of events began when Nelson Chisale returned to Scott Crosley's farm near Hoedspruit to retrieve his belongings after being fired for an alleged theft. When Chisale attempted to reclaim his possessions, he was seized by farm workers who claimed to be following Scott Crosley's instructions. Chisale was tied to a tree and subjected to a brutal beating, with Scott Crosley himself allegedly involved. All parties agreed that Chisale was to be loaded into a truck by Scott Crosley and Matebula before being driven to the Mokolo White Lion Project and thrown into an enclosure housing 5 white lions. Robert Nisi, who had taken part in the assault, described the last painful hours of Chisale before he was thrown into the lion enclosure. He testified that Chisale had still been alive and had screamed when he was thrown into the enclosure. In contrast, Scott Crosley denied hearing any such sound and believed Chisale was already dead. Forensic evidence presented inconsistencies. The state pathologist suggested that Chisale had been alive and was mauled to death by the lions, while a private pathologist, testifying for the defense, contended that Chisale appeared to have been dead before being thrown into the enclosure. The case was further complicated due to the limited remains of Chisale that were recovered, including a partial skull, a few bones, and a finger fragment used for identification. Blood-stained remnants of Chisale's clothing were also recovered. Throughout the trial, scores of demonstrators protested outside the Phalaborwa courthouse expressing their outrage. The community, regardless of race, united in condemning the crime. Hoedspruit's mayor acknowledged that the crime had racial undertones, but emphasized that the entire town stood against it. He criticized Scott Crosley's behavior as lacking remorse and respect for others, sending a message that the rule of law must be upheld. Witnesses at the trial portrayed Scott Crosley as a man with a history of aggression and violence which was on full display for the court. Early in the trial, Scott Crosley's bail of 250,000 rands was withdrawn after he grabbed a witness by the shirt and muttered something to him. He erupted again in anger during the closing testimonies as the proceedings approached a verdict. On the 27th of April 2005, Mark Scott-Crossley and Joseph Matebula were found guilty of the premeditated murder of Chisale. The two men were returned to their cells while they awaited sentencing. On September 31, 2005, Scott Crosley was married in the Phalaborwa Magistrates Court ahead of his sentencing. Scott Crosley and Simonetta Strydom, who worked for the South African Revenue Service in Phalaborwa, were married by court officials. The couple tried to get married in the cells 2 weeks before the sentencing, but the police refused to allow Department of Home Affairs officials access to conduct the ceremony. Simonetta had been left widowed after her husband tragically passed away 6 months prior in a car accident. When sentencing came, the judge said court guidelines recommended that life sentences should be imposed when society needed to be protected from the possibility of a repeat offense, or because the offense was so monstrous that it demanded harsh punishment. Scott Crosley was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Nelson Chisale. For his part in the murder, Simon Matebula was sentenced to 15 years in prison with 3 of them suspended. The judge said Scott Crosley had masterminded the attack and forced his employees to participate in the crime. He said that Matebula had limited participation in the crime and had nothing to gain from the death of Chisale, who he had befriended and visited. After the sentencing, Scott Crosley's lawyer, Johan Engelbrecht, said he was considering an appeal. While incarcerated, Scott Crosley was also charged with assaulting a fellow inmate at the Barberton Maximum Security Prison on December 9, 2006. Scott Crosley pleaded not guilty to the assault, saying he acted in self-defense when the victim threatened him with a sharpened spoon. On February 21, 2007, the Barberton Magistrates Court found him guilty of assault and sentenced him to 2 years imprisonment or a fine of 4,000 rands, which he paid. On September 28, 2007, the Supreme Court of Appeals in Bloemfontein set aside Scott Crosley's murder conviction for the death of Chisale. It substituted 5 years imprisonment on the lesser offense of being an accessory after the fact for his life sentence. The court found the prosecution had not proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Chisale was alive when he was thrown into the enclosure. The judges found that the wounds inflicted on Chisale by Scott Crosley's co-accused when he was not present could reasonably have caused the deceased's death before he was transported to the Lion Park. The court then ruled that Scott Crosley would serve the remainder of his sentence for the lesser offense backdated to September 30, 2005. Simon Matebula, on the other hand, did not have his case reviewed and was forced to serve his sentence to completion. Following Scott Crosley's release, Chisale's family made an impassioned plea for the release of Simon Matebula, who was still serving a 12-year sentence for his involvement in the tragic incident. Chisale's niece and family spokesperson urged for Matebula's immediate release, contending that Matebula's actions were a result of following Scott Crosley's instructions. She raised concerns over the disparities in parole decisions, suggesting that Matebula remained incarcerated while Scott Crosley, who is wealthy and white, was granted parole. When Matebula was sent to jail, his wife and 2 of his late sister's children were left behind to fend for themselves. Chisale's widow, Maureen, also expressed her shock at Scott Crosley's release, revealing that her family suffered greatly following the loss of Chisale. She also revealed that Scott Crosley failed to fulfill the pledge he made in court to give Chisale's grieving family 30,000 rands, build them a house worth 100,000 rands, and pay them 2,000 rands a month for 10 years. Unfortunately, they never heard from Scott Crosley again, and that promise was never fulfilled. Poverty set in as Chisale's sons and daughter, Selo, Tumelo and Motsidiso suffered while their mother struggled to make ends meet. Celo ultimately had to leave school and returned home to help his mother take care of his siblings, but not before his sister died of hunger and pneumonia in 2006. Scott Crosley's release was also condemned by the Confederation of South African Trade Unions, who said it is clear that those who are rich and white will continue to be treated differently to those who are poor. The family of Mark Scott-Crossley's deceased co-accused, Richard Matebula, also expressed their shock and dismay at Scott Crosley's release. Matebula's aunt, deeply affected by the news, remarked, "He is a free man today, yet he caused all the trouble." She went on to express concerns about the apparent disparity in the application of the law, suggesting that the law seems to be favoring white people. She also highlighted the need for transparency in such cases, alleging that the state failed to inform them that Scott Crosley was being released.
The man convicted of putting his worker into a lion's den several years ago is now being investigated for attempted murder.
In December 2016, Mark Scott-Crossley found himself once again in the headlines, this time for an alarming and disturbing incident. A general worker at the Mahaloholo Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Silence Mabunda, reported a harrowing encounter in which he claimed to have been a victim of a racist attack by a man believed to be Scott Crosley. From his hospital bed in Hoedspruit, Mabunda described the terrifying incident in which he said, "I am fighting for my life at the moment." Mabunda explained that the ordeal unfolded as he left a shop. The man alleged to be Scott Crosley suddenly grabbed Mabunda's cell phone and smashed it. According to Mabunda, there were witnesses who identified the man as Scott Crosley, addressing him by his first name and part of his surname. Two other individuals attempted to intervene, questioning why he had committed the act. The man's response was deeply troubling, as he proclaimed, "I don't like black people." Mabunda recounted a subsequent encounter with the same man in a car which resulted in a deliberate and chilling attack. The driver of the vehicle, believed to be Scott Crosley, struck Mabunda, then drove over him repeatedly before fleeing the scene. Mabunda was left in need of immediate medical attention, as he asked a bystander to call for an ambulance. At the time, Mabunda admitted that he did not feel any pain, but days later he reported that his whole body was in pain. After the case was reported to the police, they initially thought it was a hit-and-run incident, but following a thorough investigation, a case of attempted murder was opened and a warrant for the arrest of Mark Scott-Crossley was issued. After eluding authorities for over a month, Mark Scott-Crossley was finally arrested in January 2017, when he turned himself in to the police in Pretoria with the assistance of his lawyer. The state had accused Scott Crosley of intentionally trying to kill Silence Mabunda following a heated altercation. A few days later, Mark Scott-Crossley made his first appearance in the Linene Magistrates Court, drawing the attention of local residents who had assembled to observe the legal proceedings. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was tense, with some protesters vehemently opposing the possibility of Scott Crosley being granted bail. Among the demonstrators, there were even chants calling for the disgraced farmer to be killed. Scott Crosley was ultimately granted bail while he awaited his trial, but first a 2-year legal battle ensued where Scott Crosley tried and failed to have all charges against him dismissed. In September 2019, the trial finally began but dragged on for 4 years as the case was marred by delays that can be attributed to the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. When the trial finally resumed, the victim, Silence Mabunda, who still had a brace around his injured leg and crutches due to the incident, took to the witness stand and gave his testimony. Defense attorney Carl Van Tonder questioned Mabunda about the color of the vehicle that ran him over. Mabunda said he was run over by a grey Jeep, while the defense said the color of the vehicle is actually blue. The photos at court showed the color of the vehicle was dark blue, with grey stripes on the front, which is the direction Mabunda says he saw the vehicle from. In the Linyenye Magistrates Court, prosecutor Eric Mabapa confronted Scott Crosley, alleging that he had deliberately aimed his jeep at Mabunda, resulting in the incident where he ran over Mabunda after damaging his cell phone. The state's case revolved around the belief that the incident appeared racially motivated. Scott Crosley, however, pleaded not guilty to the charges. Mabapa pressed Scott Crosley on his anger management during the incident, suggesting he had failed to control his emotions. Scott Crosley denied this, insisting that he had lost control of the car, describing it as a mistake on his part. The prosecutor also questioned Scott Crosley's choice to contact his attorney immediately after the incident rather than notifying the police who had a warrant out for him, suggesting that Scott Crosley's intent was to avoid getting into legal trouble. Scott Crosley, on the other hand, explained that he sought legal advice and was unaware that it should have been reported to the police. He claimed that he had arranged to meet with the property owner after his jeep also knocked down a wall, but he had not yet done so. Defense lawyer Carl Van Tonder informed the court that they would be summoning journalists who had previously interviewed Mabunda to testify. He said that part of the evidence presented in court relied on Mabunda's statements to the journalists, and given the various versions of the incident in the media, their testimony was crucial. Scott Crosley continued to defend himself on the stand. He expressed his belief that Mabunda had fallen into a hole, resulting in a leg injury. He said that it was unusual that Mabunda was found under a small tree and claimed that he had initially checked the area after the accident but found no one there, leading him to doubt that Mabunda had been hit by a car. Scott Crosley told the court that it was bloody impossible for him to have knocked down Mabunda. He further blamed several state witnesses for creating fake stories about the incident and reiterated his stance that Mabunda was not severely injured. As the trial drew closer to its conclusion, it was hit by another series of postponements which delayed judgment for almost 18 months. The victim expressed his frustration with the Linyenye Magistrates Court at the time, alleging that the legal process had been excessively slow. On October 4, 2023, the Linyenye Magistrates Court finally delivered its verdict finding Mark Scott-Crossley guilty. He was convicted of the attempted murder of Silence Mabunda as well as the malicious damage of property. Scott Crosley currently awaits sentencing, and it is anticipated that he will receive a substantial sentence given his status as a repeat offender. The verdict marked the culmination of a lengthy legal battle, bringing a sense of closure to the case. Hopefully this time they lock him up and throw away the key. My heart goes out to all the victims and their families. This is Ghost Nation Stories. Stay safe.